On behalf of the Pacific Northwest Railroad Archive and the Northern Pacific Railway Historical Association and our friends and hosts, the Highline Heritage Museum, welcome to our special event. Today we have the pleasure of spending some time with our dear friend Jack Christensen. Jack is a retired railroad employee with 57 years of service. Jack is a well-regarded painter and also a noted author. And today we'll also have the pleasure of doing a book signing with Jack later in today's program. But first, we're going to spend some time with Jack as he describes some of his favorite paintings. Selected by Jack, each painting in today's presentation is a bit of a chapter from Jack's career. At the end of our presentation today, Jack will be autographing copies of his newly released and updated book, Tales of the Northern Pacific. Certainly a bestseller if there ever was one. Courtesy of the NPRA company's store, we have copies available for you today for $27. These items will also be available at the NPRA store website in the future. We've also got, as a limited edition event for today, posters of some of Jack's painting. These are also available for purchase and autographing for a modest fee of $10. For those joining us online, please mute your mic and submit any questions that you may have through the chat. We'll do some questions and answers at the end of today's period. Now please, folks, join with me in giving a warm welcome to Jack Christensen and Gary Tarbox. Good afternoon, gentlemen. How are you?
We're doing fine.
Yeah,
Okay,
well,
take it away, guys.
just being here is good, isn't it?
At our age, what the heck? So, Jack, these paintings all came out of your career, various capsulated images that represent some of the jobs you worked.
Yeah. Well, this is you can see this is a Class S4 1902 10-wheeler. There were only about 40 of them built, I think. And if you talk to an East End employee back in Minnesota, Montana, they never heard of them, but they were all out on the West End. You can see behind the engine there's an empty log flat. And this is the North Bend local. They're heading back towards North Bend with the empty log flats and whatever cars they have. And back in the 50s, when we still had steam, early 50s, late 40s, North Bend local was generally based at North Bend. Sometimes a train master would try running it out of Woodinville or even Seattle, but generally worked out of North Bend. And now the railroad, 100 miles was a day's work and 8 hours was a day's work. So if you work 16 hours, you got 250 miles, 2.5 days pay. And these jobs generally work 16 hours or close to it. And so you would get, the miles would pile up and you were limited to 38 days a month in pay, sort of spread the work around on these high-paying jobs. And so I would catch one off the extra board when somebody got, they say they got their miles and they had 3,800 miles by working these 16-hour jobs. So I'd get up there, maybe be up there for a week to finish out the month. And everybody's miles started a different day of the month. A, B, and C, where I fell in, we were the first of the month. D, E, and F was the 5th, and then there was the 10th and the 15th, 20th. So if you were working a job, your miles started at that time of the month. So everybody wasn't putting in for it all at once. And in the summer, it was kind of a picnic. You'd start out of North Bend and with a log, go up to Tanner, to the end of the line, get the logs, and bring them down, pick up the chip cars at the Weyerhaeuser mill in Snoqualmie. You had to go over the bridge over the river to get those. And you'd head down the raging river, and say if you had 15 cars of logs, some chips, these headed from Raging River at Falls City up to Preston was about almost a 2% grade, and these little engines could only handle 800 tons, so we'd have to triple the hill. And they were hand-fired engines, and of course we had a couple brakemen on the job, and we'd cut just short of the Raging River Bridge, take the first cut. The brakeman would fire one cut, I'd fire one cut. So it really wasn't all that much work, even with a coal burner. And we'd get down to Issaquah and do switching there. In the Woodinville, there was always business at North Bend. Of course, running along Lake Sammamish was kind of nice, and we'd go as far as we were bulletin, I think, as far as Seattle, or the north yard limits of Seattle. There's a lot of stories connected for it, but
You normally dump those logs at Kenmore.
Pardon?
You normally dump those logs at Kenmore?
Yeah, the logs would go to Woodinville, and they had to be sorted out because some dumped at Kenmore and some went somewhere else. And of course, leaving Woodinville towards Seattle, we go by the Wayne Golf Course, and we'd always stop and look for golf balls. Stop for coffee somewhere, go to Beans somewhere. In other words, a long-hour job was just a long summer picnic, actually. And we went down as far, there was quite a lot of work at the Naval Air Station. Remember one time we had a broken airline to the driver brakes on a 13. We had the brakes on the tender, but it was cracked at a union. It was leaking air, so we cut it out, cut the driver brakes out. And we headed down into Naval Air and told them about it, and they dropped everything they were doing and came out with aviation tools, I guess, and repaired this 1902 locomotive.
Let's move on then to the next one here. It's a 1713 at Sioux
Yeah, this
Creek.
is the 1713. There's double heading extra east with a Sow Malley, Z3 Malley. This is coming up Sioux Creek. That's the Green River Bridge in the background. 1713 was at Auburn a long time and finished her life at Duluth, as a lot of engines did when they were getting ready for scrap. They sent them to Duluth, and she worked on the Old Town Transfer, 1958, was it, February? The last revenue trip for a steam locomotive on the Northern Pacific. I fired the 1713. I've got a few time books, not very many from the firing days, but the 1713 appears quite a lot.
And that's in helper service with a
The
Z3.
Sow Malley was good for 1,250 ton on the mountain, so they would, but they were limited to 3,750 out of Auburn. So, because they would get two Sow Malleys helpers at Leicester, one in front, one behind the caboose. We'll show that later, but they took a helper out of Auburn with 3,750 tons.
So let's look at that one in.
And there's the way they got to Leicester. They took the W3 helper, 72, would take that off. They'd put a helper crew in front of the caboose and one behind, called it one in and one on. And when they got up into the tunnel section, they would stay that way all the way till they entered the big tunnel at Stampede. The rear unit, as soon as they got most of the train in the tunnel where the grade was much less, the rear helper would be cut off on the fly. It'd drop back to Stampede to go into the siding. And they would have they had a staff system between Stampede and Martin. They would have a helper staff that would take them back, let them go back through the tunnel, and they'd generally go into the siding at Stampede. The helper on front would go all the way through to Martin, and they would stop the train at Martin, so the helper and caboose were clear of the siding. The helper would back up, cut the caboose off, head into the siding, They'd roll the caboose by gravity down to the train. The helper would pull alongside and they'd wash the caboose because it was dirty from the tunnel. And then the train would continue without any helpers to Easton and Yakima. And the front helper would probably, unless they wanted them at Easton, they would go back through the tunnel and couple up to the other helper and go back to Leicester.
Now, you never really worked, you only worked at Z3's one.
Well, it was westbound from Yakima.
Yeah.
It was a dead freight, and we were in practically every siding that they had. We were inferior to all trains. They were terrible engines to work on. They were hard riding and dirty. Injectors were bulky. Anyway, to make a long story short, we couldn't make Auburn on 16 hours. They tied us up at Leicester. Here's probably number one with a 2600. She was in the Seattle district for a long time. That's at the west end of the Stampede Tunnel, milepost 50. Eastbound drag is headed up there. They're figuring that they've got an approach, but they're figuring by the time they get up the other end that they'll have them lined up. The operators at Martin would have the switches lined and they could go through. You could see the Malley, the front engine's a little off center on the curve. This would be a typical snow scene. I don't remember ever firing A engines on the hill. There'd be coal burners at this time. This is one of Bill, I think was either Ken Vogel's and Bill Zidell bought it. It's still around. This is the famous Timken. It shows it as an oil burner coming into Easton. I did several versions of this. As I say, I don't ever remember working an A engine in Yakima. Well, I remember one time, yeah, there's a story in the book working an extra to Yakima. It's something to do with violating Rule G. But there were several versions of this. The 2626 was modified. Eventually it was a coal burner and eventually an oil burner.
Well, this particular spot was a favorite of Ron Nixon's photos.
Yeah, it was a favorite photographing of Lake Easton. You had the approach signals. You can see on the double track approach signals to Easton. This thing is kind of a washed out from the original, but it's supposed to be a night scene. And that's one of the only painting where I painted myself in the picture. I should be the guy taking the water up there on the tank. And I was able to hold the night passenger once in a while. See, we shared with the Tacoma district. We had 40 miles on the line to Portland. They had 148, so we had 22% of the work. And of course, the night train, 402, was divided between the three railroads. So we only had the job every third year. And then when we had it, we had to share it with the Tacoma district. And we had maybe one job there were three crews that worked that night job. You go down and back, down one night, back the next, and off the third. It was the midnight run out of Seattle. We would have the job for maybe one job for 8 months of the year of the three crews, the Seattle district. And it was a night job, but it was fairly well paid, so it went pretty high. I was able to hold it for maybe a week at a time, and somebody'd bump me because they'd set the board up, the engineers, or cut it. But there was one, I think in about 1953 or 54, in February, I was able to hold it for 5 weeks running. And and the engineers, Paul Roselle was he was one of my mentors when I went for, he would let me run the engine part way, and quite a thrill to handle A engine on that job. And there was a lot of air brake work because we had 20 stops going down and about the same number coming back. Some were flag stop, but most were regular stops. Some of them you had to spot the baggage car. Of course, in Centralia, you damn well better be able to spot the water plug. And that's pretty hard to do with a long passenger train and come to a floating stop. We generally pre-release at the last instant, and it'd be the rear brakes of the train were stopping it. But anyway, got to be so I knew the job pretty well. And we didn't always work with the Seattle engineer, depending on the union. Sometimes we had Tacoma engineers, and one of them came on the job. I never met the guy before in my life, and leaving Kent going down, he said, I had the fireman's seat fixed up pretty comfortably, like a throne. They had a long cushion for both when we had a brakeman on freight trains. I'd make that the back and put a square cushion there and had it with an oil burner. And he looked over, leaving Kent, he says, motioned me over, he says, you want to try your luck here? In other words, you want to, well, yeah, he didn't even ask if I knew how to do it, but I ran the engine all the way to Kelso, and he never went over and fired the engine, never said a word to me. Like I say, I'd never met the guy before. I worked with him quite a bit, but so I got a lot of experience handling passenger trains, and it was quite an experience to put the throttle out on one of those Class A engines, pull it right up to the ceiling, and charge down. And of course, the south end was a speedway anyway. Most of the curves were good for 60 miles an hour. And the speedometers, well, the A engines were the only ones that had them, and most of them didn't work. So you kind of the seat of your pants. Now, this previous one we talked about freight extra east with steam engines with a sow malley and a helper. When the FTs came, you know, the Tacoma division used to get the oldest engines in steam days because they'd put the new engines, the super steamers, on the St. Paul division. Every division would send their oldest engines one division west. And we got the leftovers. But because of the clearance in the Stampede Tunnel, we couldn't run the Z6s and Z8s. They tried it, and it was not practical. They were thinking about like the SP, a cabin front steam engine. Here the FTs came around, and it was the answer to their prayers. We got the first ones. They put them into helper service between Easton and Leicester right away. And they haven't modified it yet. They're still 6,000. This painting shows, instead of 3,750 tons with the steam engines, we could move up to 5,500 tons with 4 units from Auburn to Leicester. And they got to Leicester, they cut another 4 units in and then handled the train to Easton. So we jacked up the tonnage 30% and cut 2 helper crews off. You think of what a godsend it was to the railroad for the diesel. They actually saved the railroads. But here we're coming into Leicester. The helper's waiting back there on the eastward siding. And the head end, they know about where to stop. And the helper will be back at the caboose. And he's coming up with a swing brakeman off the caboose. And he will come up till he finds the car that the conductor selected to make the cut. And he'll cut it, and with the radio, they'll pull the head end ahead. They'll cut the helper in, and he'll pull up, and he'll go through to Easton. And they'll repeat the process at Easton to cut the helper out. But the cards that this is one of our cards that we're selling, and it explains the operation of helper service. Oh, this is 2261 on 422. I was able to hold that job same way it was shared with the Tacoma district, so we only had it part of the time. And I was able to hold that shortly before it was pulled off in the 50s. The engineer I had was Al Barsabian. He was pretty nearly deaf, but he still spoke in a whisper. The freight train guys, he was kind of a rough handler, although he had patents on air brake equipment, I understand. And I got to run the engine with him too, part of the way. And it was an oil burner and handled the 22 Q6, pretty powerful engine. 3 cars were like nothing at all. But the 422 came out of Seattle. We had 2 crews, a Monday, Wednesday, Friday, Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday. You double the road on one day. So this is 422, came out of Seattle, went over the drawbridge line to Tacoma and down into the depot. And when they left Tacoma, they would back out of the depot, brakeman riding at the rear coach, and through the interlocking at 15th Street Tower, and then up the hill to South Tacoma and down to Nisqually and St. Clair, Olympia, Aberdeen, Hoquiam. A lot of stops. Very nice job, an oil burning engine. Here's this is one of the few acrylic paintings I've done. This is the 1548. There's a good picture, I think, of Ron Nixon taken from a northbound 407 with a diesel with a 1548 at speed. And I like the W's, they're built in 1905. They had Stevenson valve gear, and they were pretty smooth even at 70 miles an hour. On the passenger connection out of Tacoma to Auburn, we had these Q4 passenger engines that if one of them was if they happened to be laid up or not available, they would substitute a W. The 1529, which they would send to Livingston in the summer to double head the line to Yellowstone Park, was they wanted an oil burner. And I've got pictures of Max King and I with a 1529. And we could use that if they didn't have a passenger engine available. And like I say, they were a pretty smooth engine at 70 miles an hour. The NP had 160 of them at one time, and most of them either hand-fired or coal burner. And during World War II, the government decided that if you had over 100,000 pounds on the drivers and half fast or heavy freight service, and a coal burner, you had to have a stoker. So while the later model W3s had duplex stokers, which were kind of cranky, the W's got simplex stokers, which were almost trouble-free. So the oldest engines had the best stokers. But here's the 1548, an oil burner. And on the Portland Freight, there's a high-speed track, and they were good for hard and fast service. This is at Stillicum, of course. I wanted to get a Great Northern painting in here, kind of be inclusive, I guess, or ecumenical. After the merger, I had to work a lot on the Great Northern, and the merger was about 2 years old. Whatever friction we had was pretty well disseminated. It had been pretty well gone. And I would say the Great Northern trainmen were very hospitable. I could go on. I don't think we have time to get into it. But anyway, this is Bern. The station is gone now, and of course it's all centralized traffic control.
That's the east
But I
side,
guess it was
east end of the tunnel, right?
What?
That's
Yeah, you're looking east. We're about a mile east of the tunnel. And I had a painting of electrics at the summit. The station's gone now, and I worked quite a bit over to Wenatchee after the merger. Like I say, the Great Northern Trainmen, I shouldn't say this, but I think they were a little more gung-ho than our guys were, especially on the south end getting over the road. But I remember we'd get a heavy westbound train, we'd get up to Merritt, which is before we start up this grade, and dispatcher'd call, he says, "Hey, do you think you can start them at Bern?" Mad Dog probably, he probably worked over there. I don't know if they ever asked you that. And if you agreed to do it, you had to be damn sure you laid sand under it when you stopped in the siding, because it was a steep grade there. So, but I thought that apparently they had a spring switch, and they'd line ordinarily the eastbound trains would go into the siding under the electric operation. Some of my Great Northern friends, Lowell Messon was one of them, the engineer. They spent a lot of time on the electrics, and it was a fascinating operation. General Motors talked them into taking the wire down in the 50s. Okay, there's Whitlock. Ken Vogel was one of our really beloved members of the NPRHA, and him and his wife, he had a clothing store over in Pullman, the college, and the clothing store looked like a railroad museum. He had conductor's mannequin with fully dressed and a lot of railroad stuff, and Ken was a great lover of chocolate. He handed out chocolates to his customers. And if you could list all the qualities that define a gentleman, you'd have a pen portrait of Ken Vogel. And he built, when he retired, he built this house at Whitlock as like an NP depot, although it had all the latest technical advances of a home.
Yeah, it had double bay windows on it.
Yeah, the bay windows. And after I retired, I worked a while as a docent for the Clark Service and riding both over to Havre and down to Portland. And Ken would come out and wave at number 11 when it went down the hill, him and his wife. Or this is the northbound passenger. A little later on that day. Ken passed away some years ago, and I decided to make a painting for Sally, which we took to the memorial. But this is Ken and Sally waving it. They would come out and wave it, and I would tell the passengers, we'd be giving them a little monologue on the points of interest along the line, and I would tell them about this rail fan that had a home built like an NP station, and they would probably be out. And so it was one of the things that passengers could look forward to, and Ken and Sally would be out waving at the train. Well, there's a cover picture. Here I am firing the 21. Max King and I worked the 2194, and that was our favorite Q4 on the Tacoma connection. He was writing for the Tacoma News Tribune, and they had a Sunday rotogravure, kind of a homemade thing wasn't glossy like the Times is, but they would pay us $25 for a story, and I'd get $25 for a painting for the cover. So we would, on the night connection, we'd go to work about 4:30. We'd run the light with empty train to Auburn and head around in East Auburn with the empty train. And I got to run the engine when we didn't have any passengers. And Max would fire it. So I'd load up the back corners and the firebox so he wouldn't have to get off the seat till we got to Sumner, because we had to shovel coal. And then he'd run number 5's connection at Tacoma. We'd sit in the depot in the coaches and I'd work on the artwork, and he'd work on his painting, on his stories. And I did, I think, 15 covers for the Tacoma News Tribune. Even after I moved to Duluth as road foreman, we did some of them by mail. But anyway, that's just a picture taken with a 2194 on the Tacoma connection.
And here we've got some credits for today's program. Jack Christensen, of course, and our presentation moderator, Gary Tarbox. And the photos of Jack's paintings come today from the PNRA collection in Burien, Washington. So we've gotten a couple of questions that have come in on the chat. So Jack, one of the questions is, what is a floating stop? You talked about a floating stop at Shahale.
We the passenger units were equipped with what they call a graduated release. Mike Sawyer would understand what I'm talking about. But the freight ones and the ABD brakes, you kicked them off, you kicked them off, and they were released.
Okay.
They released pretty fast because they had something to stimulate that thing. And of course, now they have in-train helpers that release the brakes from both consists.
Both ends at once, yeah.
But on the passenger locomotives, the steam engines have what they call a graduated release. Say if you made a pretty heavy reduction, you could go over to running and back, you could release part of it. As the speed dropped, the friction would increase rapidly. So you would kick some of the brakes off to keep the effort constant. And at the very end, you didn't want, when you stop a car, some driver stopped with a rough stop.
Right.
If you could release at the final moment so that just the rear brakes were sticking, you would get a very smooth.
So you just come to a kind of like a gliding, floating stop right at that water spigot.
There was no impact or feeling of jerking or.
So there must be a reverse, so that when you got the train going again after taking water and unloading sometimes all those baggage cars and freight, because you had a lot of freight
once
there,
you made
didn't
this floating stop, of course, you'd reset the brakes to make sure the brakes were set while you were standing at the depot.
Because you'd have quite a bit of work to do at that depot, wouldn't you, especially on the night train?
The thing about 402, it was a long 7-hour run to Portland. You think, boy, that's pretty slow, but you figured 20 stops. And
right.
Places like Tenino, there was a certain amount of baggage. And at Centralia, you had 20 minutes on the timetable, but sometimes you'd be an hour and 15 minutes loading fish.
Loading fish?
Yeah, express reefers.
Now going which way, to Portland or Seattle or both?
And you'd be starting out 25 minutes late. You'd beat the hell out of those A engines to get back on time.
Right.
So.
And of course, there was always an issue, at least southbound, as I recall, making sure that you had enough water to make it all the way there.
Well, that's another thing. They had a 15,000. The NP always were niggardly on their tenders. The Malleys and the W3s only had 9,300 gallons, 10,000 gallons. Here's the Great Northern with their Mikes. They had 15,000 gallon tanks, and they were way ahead of us on that. They had mechanical lubricators. We only had one engine at Auburn with a mechanical lubricator.
Which one was that?
1745.
Oh, okay.
Wimpy McBride had that on the Sumas run.
Now, you went to Sumas a few times, didn't
the
you,
old
Jack?
hydrostatic lubricators, you had to be fiddling with them all the time. But any modern power had mechanical lubricators for the running gear. But as I say, they had these stops, and you had to beat the engine quite a bit to make it in,
Get back on schedule, and that'd be a heavy train too, wouldn't it be, with all that front end stuff?
And you had a fairly good train. We had the SP sleepers, and and just the mail. It was a lot of air brake work on that, where you didn't have like 408, 407. All they had was Tacoma and Centralia,
Longview,
East Olympia.
Yeah.
And sometimes you had to have passengers going a certain distance to have a flag stop. But I know the combination of regular and flag stops on the night train was, I think, 20 going down and 22 coming back.
Wow, that's all. Yeah. So then, and stop and go and stop and go and try to
Lots
stay
of air
on
brake
schedule.
work. Yeah.
Yeah. So then, was working that night train one of your favorites then? Or what was your favorite steam locomotive, and which train was that favorite?
Well, favorite steam well, I liked the A's, of course, and we got a lot of the engineers would let you run the engine if you did a good job, and some of the old heads wouldn't, but and the guys that were laid off during the Depression, they were the best of all. They knew how to fire an engine. They could keep it hot too. So.
Okay, and then now for what was your favorite group of diesel locomotives from later in your career then?
Oh, it's hard. Well, I talk about in the book. I've got a note that I should include on the book. We made this little slip to put in the book on a disclaimer or a note on the.
So we're
and
working
I talk
on the
about
third
the
edition
SD.
now. Is that right?
I talk about the diesel, the SD40, EMD SD40.
That was the best diesel ever, wasn't it, for the
I don't know,
BN?
Mike, what do you think about well, they were pretty much of a workhorse.
Best thing I ever ran.
Yeah,
Chris, what do you think? Chris Hall, another engineer, is here with us today.
SD40-2 until the Evos showed up.
Yeah. Hey, Chris, yeah. Chris and I worked together a little bit, you know.
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, a couple of your proteges are here enjoying today's
they were a
presentation.
workhorse, and they were really our basic freight locomotive till we got these pumpkins from both EMD and GE.
So Jack, at every one of these get-togethers, there's always the one story that I want to ask you about the road foreman and the fireman going to Sumas. You remember that one?
Well, Max King wrote a story about that called The Fireman's Friend.
Yeah.
And I don't know if I included that in the book or not, but
Boy, you should have. I know, but you'd share it here so that we've got it, right? Keep going.
yeah. Well, they were having when the W3s came, they didn't have stokers on them. And the W1s and W1s had a 43 square feet of grade area, 43 point something, 43 and a half. The W3s had the same wheelbase, same length, but they had a fatter boiler and a 70 square foot grade area. And they soon found out that even a strong person could not shovel enough coal to take care of that grade area. And we had a couple, Max King writes about one who died. I don't know how much of it was fiction. I know we had one person that did die on the Sumas run. They had 2 firemen for a while on the Sumas run. It was 139 miles and several tough hills.
But didn't that road foreman think that you guys were gold bricking
Well,
there?
this new road foreman was going to show how to do it.
Really?
And the engineer was a crabby old fellow that kept to himself that he picked on the Sumas run. They had 3 crews there. And according to Max, this road foreman, because he's going to show them how they could do it, and he's going to fire the engine. And Max, of course, he's kind of just sitting there, and he tells him how he's, he realized the first thing that there's an extra step between the fire door and the coal pile because the engines were built for stokers, but the NP didn't.
Oh, I didn't know that. Okay.
So anyway, according to the story, the guy, he's really, these hills are really getting him, and he's, Max is gonna, every time Max wants to help this old engineer, says, you go and sit over there. He says, you can't do the job. They're trying to get in his way. And the gist of it was that he wouldn't let Max help this road foreman at all. And at one point he told Max, he says, why do you keep wanting to do that? He asked for this, let him stew in his own juice.
Oh boy.
By the time he got to Cedar Woolley, the guy had to give up. He just was too exhausted. So Max had to take over, and so that's why they had the 2 firemen. I do know that they did have 2 firemen at Auburn, and I do know that one person
Couldn't do it alone all the way to Sumas.
one person had died on route. So,
Shoveling coal was just so
Yeah.
strenuous for him.
and then they put the duplex stokers on, and they were,
Helped?
well, they were a little tricky. They had problems too. Like I say, the simplexes that came later were much better.
Okay. So yeah, we're thinking about that Sumas line. That's 140 miles, and you've got hills. Where were the hills at again? Remind me.
Well, Maltby was
Sure.
about 1.8 or 9, and
Yeah.
Getchell a little less. Then there was about 1 hill out of Cedar Woolley. And when we got the FT diesels, of course, that made it a completely different thing. Usually on steam days, you ate at Arlington. Your halfway point. You'd go to the Bluebird Cafe. I think the Bluebird's still there, and I think the original waitresses are still there.
Oh my. And the food's probably still as good, right?
Well, I guess we've still got our line as far as Arlington. I don't know if they've abandoned it yet, but
Well, there's still some track out there, but it's just not the same as the good old days, right,
I knew they
Jack?
came up to there was a telephone pole plant there near between Edgecombe and Arlington, but I don't know what's up there now. But the diesels came, and they finally got us to quit. Not if we didn't go to Beans, they wanted the train up to Sumas earlier. So if we ran our Beans, we were allowed to take an extra hour on our switching, because you got a combination of miles and terminal switching on that job, which was the highest paying job on the division.
Was it? Okay, so was it a night train back then and you'd
It
get
was
up
a
there?
day train out of Auburn.
Okay.
7:30, you got up to Sumas around 1 or 2.
Oh,
Tied up about 5 or 6. Went to work at 11 o'clock the next morning, so the boozers could, hang out and they could tie it on and be ready to work by 11 o'clock. And you had about 4 or 5 hours switching. When the diesel came up at 1 or 2 o'clock, you'd trade engine. You had a switch engine up there.
yeah.
And then it's different now. They're different.
Oh, sure.
But you had 4 or 5 hours switching, then you'd take the train down to Auburn and get down to Auburn after midnight sometime. So you had a down one day and back the next. It was the highest paying job on the division because it was local freight and 4, sometimes 5 units. And at that time, it paid $1,000 a month to a fireman.
Wow. And that was pretty good money for a fireman back then. What
Back
year
in
was
the
this?
50s it was, yeah.
50s, yeah. 1,000 a month was good money back then.
I was able to hold it once in a while. I had a regular.
But that was one I would imagine went to pretty high seniority people, right? Because it was a good payer.
Yeah.
And of course,
was.
it worked out well for people's social agenda too, as you were just saying. right?
Well, yeah, it was.
And Sumas was a fun town back in the day, I'm sure.
Well, some people would call it that.
Yeah, okay, yeah, I was just there, a little quiet. So then Stampede passed, Jack. Did you work helpers out of Leicester?
I don't recall. See, when I hired out, they were scraping the bottom of the barrel in 1944. I was already enlisted in the Air Force
Right.
for a cadet program. They were going to call me up and overdue. We could have been called up after we graduated from high school. When they hired me, I told them I could be called up tomorrow, but I worked exactly a month before I was called up, just before Christmas.
Just
Can you
before
imagine?
Christmas, and then your dad had to come and find you at Leicester.
Well,
didn't
I
he?
was firing the Roslyn branch with a hand-fired W, 1501,
Yeah.
for Alec Taylor. And we had a long-hour job, and I was staying in a flea bag hotel. We had to pay for our own, $1 a night.
Roslyn now is
Tells
this,
the
or were you
class
staying
of
in Clay?
hotel. And here, it was a long-hour job, but it was a day job. Anyway, here at midnight or 2 o'clock in the morning, my dad comes banging on the door. He'd come over on number 2 because he got the orders from the Air Force. Instead of a week to report, I had 24 hours. It screwed up the orders, and I had to be there the next day. So he says, they've got a guy coming over on number 4, and we're coming home on number 1. He only got an hour before they were due at Cleellum. Luckily, 2 and 1 met at Yakima. So
Oh, they did. Okay, I
at
didn't know
those
that.
days, in the steam days.
And so then they would run over the hill at night?
Yeah, that afternoon I was down in Fort Lewis. I was in the Air Force.
In the Air Force, but then,
So just exactly a month of firing. So, I didn't get a lot of time. And when I came back, diesel power was really taking over, and
so
things
were you
were-
able to keep your date then from 44?
Yeah, and then I went to college on the GI Bill.
Yeah.
And I went over to WSC, and you got a year. When you went in World War II, you were given a year plus your actual months of GI Bill. So I had 23 months.
All
'cause
right.
I was only in 11 months. We got out early because they closed everything down. And
Because the war got over.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's
They,
okay.
they wanted to get rid of us because we hadn't done anything. I'm a veteran, but the closest I ever got to harm's way was a visit to the Hollywood canteen. 'Cause we were stationed. I was servicing airplanes for the guys ahead of me down at Bakersfield. And there's still a big Air Force port down there. But anyway, with this GI Bill, I could only get a leave of absence if I was on GI Bill.
Oh,
So after 2 years at Washington State, because I'd come back and I'd work in the summer,
right.
and they were always glad to get me at Christmas time because, I was out of school and everybody wanted to be off. So I worked summers and Christmases for 2 years. But in the junior year, we transferred to the UW, and I killed 2 birds with 1 stone because I needed the money. I was out of GI Bill. I could work a night switch engine, and I'd keep my seniority.
Okay, so let me get this straight. So you were going to the University of Washington by day and switching down at Stacy Street by
Well,
night?
it was diesel switch engines,
Oh, that wasn't as much work?
Well, depending whether you're running the engine or sleep or being in the fireman's.
Okay. And what did you get your degree in, Jack?
Petroleum geology.
And then did you actually go out and poke holes in the ground for a
Well,
while?
I was offered a job for the groundwater branch in Washington, D.C.,
Yeah.
and but I needed a leave of absence.
Oh.
And the superintendent says, absolutely not. That's outrageous. You got to protect the job. These guys below you are protecting your job. Well, you try out another job. But Paul Roselle, who was the firemen's local chairman, representative, somehow he wangled a year's leave in 90-day increments. I had to apply for each one.
Okay.
And, it was an interesting job. My boss was Gerald G. Parker, spelled Gerald with 2 A's. Google him. You can Google him. He was
Because
a
he has 2
famous
A's, he's easy to Google.
He was chief of the groundwater branch at UW man, famous hydrologist. I worked. I was there I took 3 90-day leaves, and a lot of it was well logs, measuring well performance in the District of Columbia. And a lot of it was Anacostia, where 7 railroads came into a double roundhouse. And I was down there doing well logs, and here was all these beautiful locomotives, blue painted with the B&O and the Richmond, Fredericksburg, Potomac, the Atlantic coastline, the Southern,
Sure, all
C&O,
of those.
the
Wow.
Penzi. with
Penzi,
their
of course,
electrics.
yeah. Newark.
It was just a panoply of locomotives, electric, diesel, steam. I got so homesick for the railroad, I didn't take the 4th leave, and he was not very happy with me.
Oh, because, railroading was just, by that time, was in your blood and wasn't
Neither
going
was
anywhere.
one of the ladies that I was kind of concerned with who was working there. I don't know what, a Southern Belle.
Oh.
Anyway,
Well, that's
I
a
came
story
back,
for another day.
I came back to Seattle and went back to work as a fireman.
Working
that
down
was-
at Stacy Street then, or?
Well, I worked the extra board a lot. Mostly couldn't hold very much. Worked out of Auburn when I could. No, the night switch engines, that was while I was going to college, and then shorts for one other time I worked it for a while, but whatever I could hold, I preferred the road work.
Oh, versus working in the yard then, being out where you could see some
I don't know
scenery
how
and do some
different people
stuff.
feel about it. I know Kim, she prefers the yard work, doesn't she?
Yes.
Yeah. And some people, we had guys that never came out. A lot of Seattle men didn't come out on the road.
Just like we're happy in the yard. Well, folks, we're getting to the end of the program today. I'm going to just check with Josh in the back. Josh, have we gotten any more questions in the chat? We've gotten no more questions in the chat. Does anybody here in the room have a question for Jack? Now's a good time. There's a question. Go ahead,
I'm
please.
kind of curious now, did the smoke that came out of these things, was the color any different, whether it was wood, oil, coal, or?
Well, it depended on how you were crowding. If you crowd the fire either with coal or oil, it'd get blacker. Sometimes photographers would want the firemen to make black smoke, and if you didn't get the word out, they wouldn't be able to do it. With an oil burner, you could just open the oil valve. The stoker would take a look. It all depended, on the condition of the fire. It looks like Kent Sullivan out there.
Yeah, it sure is. Yeah, he can. We're almost done with today's program. In fact, at this point, I'm going to say just a couple of closing thoughts. For more information on today's program, this program will be on our YouTube channel one of these days, and you'll be able to check that out at the PNRA Archive YouTube channel. For more information on today's program, please contact me. And the easiest way, the quickest spelling is INFO at pnraarchive.org, and we can give you more information about that. We're going to have some of Jack's books available that are going to be autographed. Those of you that are watching remotely, if you contact me at that email address I just gave you, info@pnraarchive.org, I can arrange to get you a signed copy. It's $27, including the tax, from the NPRHA company store. And we've got some really cool posters out there, and those are going to be available after the show as well, and contact me for those. Jack's going to be autographing some of his favorite pictures from today's presentation. Those are certainly to be a collector's item for the future. So again, everyone, thank you so much for the audience that's here in person, and thank you so much for those of you that have joined in with the program today on the Zoom platform. And we were so excited to be able to spend some time with Jack, and I know I'm looking forward to the next opportunity to get back together and talk some trains with Jack. So for today's presentation, I want to say thank you and have a great rest of your day. Bye for now.